So today we will be looking at why Rachmaninoff stopped composing after he left Russia in 1917. So from 1917 until 1926, Rachmaninoff composed no original works. He made some transcriptions of other composers' works. He also wrote a cadenza to a Liszt concerto, but there was no original output. And from 1926 until his death in 1943, he only wrote 6 original works, as long as a few more transcriptions and revisions of his earlier works. And in order to know why this happened, we'll be looking at the cultural context of the time, Rachmaninoff's background, most notably the failure of his first symphony and the impact it had on him throughout the rest of his career as a composer. The period of writer's block following the first symphony can also provide clues for why he stopped composing the second time around, as well as Rachmaninoff's struggles with his mental health and self-image. And here, content warning for depression. Timestamps are in the description, so if you don't feel comfortable with a particular topic, feel free to skip around as you wish. Other than that, I am excited to get into it, so I hope you enjoy the video and thank you for watching. So to start off, we need to look at Rachmaninoff's first symphony and the years at the Moscow Conservatory that he spent leading up to this. So in school, Rachmaninoff was very naturally talented in both his composition and performance classes. He could get by without studying very hard, and when he did put the effort in, he could get some pretty impressive results. Multiple times on exams where the high score was a 5+, he earned a 5++++, and his teachers were always showing him off to the musical elite of the city. All this gave him a rather inflated ego. He had a very high, and as we'll see in a minute, a very fragile self-confidence. When he went to write his first symphony, he was very excited. He thought he was forging new paths in music. He ignored the constructive criticism of his composition teacher, partly due to this temporary arrogance and partly due to the sense of stubborn independence that would remain with him throughout his entire life. However, when the first symphony was actually premiered in St. Petersburg, it was not everything that Rachmaninoff had hoped for. In fact, it was a complete disaster, and there are several reasons for this. One is the potential faults in the music itself. As I said before, Rachmaninoff had ignored a lot of the advice his teachers had given him, and at the first rehearsal of the symphony, he had started noticing that the music wasn't really shaping up to how he had imagined it would sound. 2 is that at the premiere, the conductor was drunk, so he did not do a very good job of leading an orchestra that was 3 under-rehearsed due to lack of rehearsal time. And finally, there was a bit of musical politics involved. So remember how I said Rachmaninoff studied at the Moscow Conservatory, but the premiere took place in St. Petersburg? Well, that actually had quite a big impact because at the time, those 2 schools were rivals. St. Petersburg was all about Russian nationalism, while Moscow was more accepting of Western composers, and they each looked down upon each other. And so here there was a new composer from Moscow premiering a symphony in St. Petersburg, and the St. Petersburg critic saw this as an opportunity to absolutely disembowel Rachmaninoff's work. One critic called it music that would be played in the conservatories of hell. The audience reception was also not much better, with most people sitting there in a state of general bewilderment. So this extremely negative reaction to a work that he had originally been so proud of really caused Rachmaninoff to change his entire outlook on his abilities as a composer. He went from extreme self-confidence, bordering on arrogance, to extreme self-doubt. This sense of modesty or self-doubt would remain with him for his entire career. This event also either caused or triggered his depression, and combined with self-doubt resulted in a 3-year writer's block where he wrote very little. And here's where I need to make the distinction between writer's block and creative block. Following the first symphony, Rachmaninoff still wanted to compose and to express himself through music. He actually attempted to write another symphony, ironically, just a couple weeks after the first symphony's premiere. He also wanted to start writing a new piano concerto, but because he doubted whether or not he was a good enough composer, he was afraid to write them down, have them premiere to an audience, and have the same disastrous reception as with the first symphony. Rachmaninoff did eventually get over his writer's block in the very well-known story of his second concerto. And as much as I love this story because of how much it has inspired me as well as probably thousands of other people, there are some aspects of it that have been overlooked and it's becoming legend in music history. At the insistence of his friends and family, Rachmaninoff finally went to see a doctor to try and cure him of this writer's block. Dr. Nikolai Dahl would first tend to Rachmaninoff's physical health, such as making sure he was eating right, sleeping right, and getting some exercise, and then he would actually hypnotize Rachmaninoff, get him him into a state where he would be very open to suggestions and then say to him over and over again, "You will write a new concerto, it'll be received very well." And almost incredibly, after a few months of this, Rachmaninoff had the confidence to begin composing again, which resulted in the much-loved Second Concerto. Now you might be thinking, how did Dr. Dahl really cure Rachmaninoff if what he did was just repeating, "You'll write a great concerto" to him over and over again? Now, I think, and I'm in no way a medical professional of any kind, you can just take this with a grain of salt, but I think that Dr. Dahl never really cured Rachmaninoff's depression. We can actually see that later in life, this depression recurred often. Instead, he gave Rachmaninoff the necessary self-confidence that had been destroyed with the First Symphony. And so with self-confidence, Rachmaninoff was no longer afraid to write his music down and present it to the world, and so he began composing again, first with the Second Concerto, as well as many other works. But his depression never completely left him, and neither did his self-doubt. They both would recur many times later in his life. So if knowing those details kind of ruins the story of the Second Concerto for you, I'm sorry, but I think it's still a testament to the power of human strength and will and the ability to endure, even in the most difficult circumstances. As with many of Rachmaninoff's pieces, it focuses on the human struggle, but places the emphasis on the ability to overcome that struggle. Now that we've looked at the First Symphony, we have some clues that can help us figure out why he stopped composing after 1917, after he left Russia. We need to look at why exactly he left and what happened afterwards. So he left because of the 1917 Russian Revolution, in which there was a lot of political and social turmoil, and he decided it would not be a safe place for him and his family. When leaving Russia, he had to leave most of his money as well as his estate behind, so when he settled in America, he needed a way to support his family. And he did this by becoming a concert pianist, which, let's just take a moment to realize how incredible that is. He was something like 45 years old at the time, just left his homeland to settle in a new country. He had to switch careers, learn all of this repertoire for being a concert pianist, and tour very incessantly. He did something like 50 concerts per year. And here's where we can start to see the first reason for why Rachmaninoff may have stopped composing, is that his schedule as a concert pianist did not allow him enough time to compose. I would say this is one of the main reasons. He had to learn and maintain a massive repertoire, whereas before 1917, where he was primarily a composer, he would mostly just play his own pieces in concert and just supplement that with a few works by other composers. He also put a lot of time and dedication into practicing. He very much valued slow practice, very methodical, take everything apart, polish each individual piece, and then put everything back together. He also used to spend his summers composing, and now he had to work up new repertoire for the new season because he never let his repertoire go stale. And finally, in the bustle of life in America, he lacked that peace and quiet that he so needed to compose. Many of his greatest pieces, Isle of the Dead, Second Symphony, Third Concerto, etc., they were all composed in very quiet environments, like his retreat in Dresden and his summer estate in Ivanovka. But while this lack of time and lack of solitude was a major contributing factor to why he stopped composing, there are always more factors to consider. For example, in 1926, he took a year off of his touring schedule in order to compose his fourth piano concerto, but he still had a lot of trouble writing it. And here's where we get to explore some of the more interesting reasons of why he stopped composing. The first being that after Rachmaninoff left his beloved homeland, he lost a lot of his cultural identity. What Rachmaninoff said about composition was that music should express the composer's personality, their emotions, cultural background, religious background, etc. And so after he left his homeland behind, he lost a lot of the identity that made up what he wanted to express in his music. He even said, "To the exile whose musical roots, traditions, and background have been annihilated, there remains no desire for self-expression." He also lost some of his cultural connections to his audience in America. Here's where we get to explore the rather interesting idea of whether music can truly be universal or whether it is tied to the culture it was created in. On the one hand, you have the argument that music is international. Rachmaninoff's music especially has that emotional appeal that can resonate with anyone, no matter what background they come from. Music can create a mutual understanding between people and can connect them where words cannot. However, you could also argue that to some extent music is culture specific. People of different backgrounds have different shared experiences, different ways of thinking. In very rough terms, each place has its unique vibe. People of that place have different reactions to art. If this is true, then after Rachmaninoff left Russia, he also left that deeper connection that he had with his audience. So he was separated from his homeland, his source of inspiration, and his audience. But even if he did go back to Russia, the country that he knew and loved was no longer the same. Remember that Rachmaninoff left because of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and Rachmaninoff himself was very much a part of the middle class, or bourgeoisie, who were definitely frowned upon during that time. His beloved summer estate, Ivanovka, where he wrote so many of his most famous works, was also destroyed, and for a time his music was actually banned because of something he said to criticize the Soviet regime. So even if he did go back to Russia, it would not be the same Russia that had been such a great inspiration to his music. So I think that this second period of writer's block was in some ways more tragic than the first writer's block. Whereas after the first symphony, he was not able to express himself. After leaving his source of inspiration behind, he not only could not express himself, but he also had nothing left to express. And ending on another happy note, I can tell you that this just keeps going. And here's the section where we will look at Rachmaninoff's mental health, starting with his self-doubt and then moving into his recurring depression. So again, timestamps in the description. Feel free to skip this section if you do not feel comfortable. So remember when we looked at the first symphony and the impact it had on the rest of his life? It really cemented a feeling of self-doubt as a composer, and this was reinforced by the musical context of the time. We tend to think of Rachmaninoff as a very romantic composer. He has those extremely emotional melodies that would usually characterize the 1800s, but he actually lived in a very modern era, and many of the other composers around him were moving into modernism, where Rachmaninoff refused to join them and stayed in a romantic tradition that had more meaning to him. To put his lifetime into perspective, Rachmaninoff was born in 1873 when Tchaikovsky was still alive and writing his intensely romantic works. Scriabin in 1903 began working on his Mysterium, which was this crazy piece that involved all of the five senses, would take place in the Himalayas, and would directly cause the end of the world. In 1913, Stravinsky wrote his Rite of Spring, which caused a riot at the premiere because of how incredibly modern it was. In 1924, when Rachmaninoff was already in America, Gershwin wrote his Rhapsody in Blue. In 1927, Shostakovich wrote his opera The Nose, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. And finally, the most jarring comparison, I think, is that in 1945, just 2 years after Rachmaninoff's death, the first and hopefully only atomic bombs ever used in combat were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Rachmaninoff's lifetime really was incredibly modern and close to ours, but his music was very much that of the 1800s. And even though throughout his career as a composer his style did change and evolve, he refused to follow the general movement into modernism and stay true to his own style of composing. Even though part of the general public always held on to his music and loved it as the last great romantic, as they called it, this feeling of being left behind in an older era contributed to Rachmaninoff's self-doubt as a composer, which in turn made it more difficult for Rachmaninoff to set his musical ideas on paper and then present them to the world. Even before the disastrous premiere of his first symphony, Rachmaninoff tended to be preoccupied with the darker side of life. Symptoms of depression were noticed by his family as early as 1894, which was right around the death of Tchaikovsky, one of Rachmaninoff's mentors in both his development as a composer and his career. The first symphony was not the root cause of his depression, only a catalyst in making it worse and sending him into a full writer's block. After the second piano concerto, contrary to popular belief, he did not completely conquer his depression. In fact, it recurred often. In the early 1910s, friends described him as seeming sick. He was crying a lot. He was very afraid that he had turned out to be a mediocre composer when composer used to come so easily to him in his younger days. And he said the failure of his first symphony was like pinching a young tree when it was just beginning to grow, sort of stopping that potential before it could really flourish. And it seems that this self-doubt and depression really did have a negative impact on his output as a composer. He was kind of stuck in a vicious cycle where he would become happier if he composed, but he needed to be happy in order to compose. And you might be thinking, why didn't he ask for help at this point? Since we saw, as with the first symphony, that therapy really helped boost his self-confidence even if it didn't completely cure his depression. And I think here is where Rachmaninoff's sense of stubborn independence prevented him from seeking help when he needed it. He was very self-reliant, always thought he could do things on his own. Even when he was a little kid, his nickname among friends and family would be Myself, because he was always pushing away the often well-intentioned help of others. Also, looking at the cultural context of the time, artists moved away from the idealism of the Romantic era into the disillusion of the early 1900s. Overall, there was this glorification of suffering, self-degradation, and just all things negative. So this sense of pessimism was very much embedded in the culture of the time, and it reinforced the natural pessimism that Rachmaninoff had, as well as the self-doubt and depression that never really left him. So to recap why Rachmaninoff stopped composing after he left Russia in 1917, first and foremost we have his busy career as a concert pianist where he did not have time, or the peace and quiet he needed to compose. Second, we have the loss of his cultural identity after leaving his homeland. Third, the self-doubt of his abilities as a composer, mostly stemming from his first symphony, and also the depression that either was caused or triggered also by his first symphony. So yeah, that's about it. Why Rachmaninoff more or less stopped composing after 1917. Do I wish that he had composed more? Yes, of course I do. Do I mean that he should have kept composing even if it didn't bring him enough income and his family would have had to fend for themselves on the streets of New York? No, but if it had been possible for him to keep composing, like just imagine how epic a Rachmaninoff violin concerto would be, or a Rachmaninoff cello concerto. Anyway, I am grateful for the pieces that he did write, and I'm also grateful for the recordings that he left behind in his career as a concert pianist. If you have not heard him play his own second piano concerto, you should. There are some places where he does the opposite of what he wrote in the score, like with dynamics or tempo, and it's truly very interesting. And I guess for Rachmaninoff's own sake, it seems that he enjoyed being a concert pianist. He once said that performing was his only joy in life, which now that I think about it is still kind of sad, but that's Rachmaninoff for you. But that is enough of that. I hope you all enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed doing the research, putting everything together. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time.